This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. In American society today, the victim is king. But why is that? This is my interview with Geoffrey Shullenberger. I am joined from New York by my friend Geoff Shullenberger, who has been teaching me a lot of things lately. He is the managing editor of Compact Magazine, which I think is the most interesting political magazine out there right now. And it's a new magazine, and I want to talk about that first. But also there's an article that you wrote in last month, in December 2022, on this guy, Renee Girard, who I've been hearing a lot about in my world. A lot of people who I know have been mentioning Girard in the last couple of years, and I didn't understand why, because I had never heard of the guy, and which is embarrassing because, you know, I'm supposed to be someone who's familiar with French philosopher types. Although he, of course, diverges from the people I like, and we will talk about that a great deal. But your article about Girard really, it illuminated a lot, and it also it made me think. I have a lot of ideas that are similar to Girard, but I think there's some interesting contradictions, and I might even object to Girard. But it's a fascinating set of theses that he lays out, or that you lay out for him, and I want to do that. But let's talk about Compact Magazine. It's only a couple of years old.
It's less than a year old, in fact.
Less than a year old.
It was founded in March of last year.
Oh my gosh, 2022.
Yeah, or it was launched in March of last year. Yeah.
And you're the original managing editor, am I right?
No, so there was no managing editor position when the magazine started, but because of growth, they were able to, create one and hire me. So I came in September, beginning of September. I was brought in to write for them earlier than that. And so I think the first piece I had maybe came out in April.
Okay.
It could have been in March. But in any case, I was writing a monthly column for them, and then, basically was brought in as managing editor. Yeah, because the magazine was successful and original in its sort of initial growth plans and was able to expand staffing. So that's where I was brought in, which conveniently also enabled me to, and gave me the opportunity to, an incentive to leave academia.
Yes.
Is, definitely the right choice. I have not looked back once. And, I have joined you and others in the wonderful realm of ex-academics, which is, where all the best ones go, as far as I can tell. So
there's no question about it. Yeah. The most interesting intellectuals are not in universities, right?
That said, it's been one thing that's kind of been interesting to see with Compact is, we do turn out to get a lot of academics who, maybe in some cases are kind of reading us on the DL.
Yeah.
But we also have academics who pitch to us, who want to write for us. So that's been kind of interesting and quite encouraging.
Yeah. So, well, I've had academics apply to me for jobs teaching at my schools, so yeah, it's funny.
So, and I do, it has made me appreciate how many, maybe more from my jaded perspective in my last several years in academia, I sort of thought there was no one interesting left, but from the compact perspective, we're sort of able to attract the attention of the most interesting people out there, and they are now writing for us in some cases. So I think in some cases they have tenure, so they're kind of able to get away with that, but not always. I mean, we've had a couple of very smart grad students who are willing to engage in the career suicide of writing for our dangerous problematic publications. So
well, they're just going to have to start their own school soon. Sorry, this is the way it has to happen. So at first glance, to me, the most remarkable thing about Compact is how it's extraordinarily, you might even say shockingly ecumenical. The diversity of ideas, of thought, of politics represented by your authors is really something. But then I suppose there's something unifying all of them, right? I mean, there's some point in writing for Compact magazine. It's not that you just like celebrate difference. It's not that you just like different ideas or the difference among ideas, but talk about, so first, you have Marxists, and I'm talking about real deal Marxists. You have Christian traditionalist Catholics who kind of run the magazine, or besides you, and who write for it. You have all sorts of people on the left and right in between. Just talk about what's going on. What's the plan here? What is Compact magazine all about? Why are you doing? Is there something? What's the political intervention you're making here?
I mean, it's a tricky question. I wasn't involved in founding the magazine. There was sort of schism between the founders in the end, which, unfolded relatively quickly, but I won't get into that. I don't want to, but so there, it's a complicated operation to achieve something like what you're describing. So, I think that, so something I find interesting in the mission statement, which I was not involved in writing, which was conceived before I was involved in the magazine, is there something about, opposing liberalism because it is at odds with the virtue of liberality, which is an intriguing and maybe ambiguous statement. I've never asked those who wrote it to explain it to me, but I do think there's something kind of interesting in that, where, part of what you're saying is, so the paradox here would be that what brings the different perspectives together is a critique of hegemonic liberalism, right?
Right.
But and that, if you look at kind of how the magazine was covered when it first appeared, it was all, it was sort of, in liberal media outlets, right? It was sort of, we're just going to bring together all the haters of liberalism, right? So it was kind of being, the way it was castigated was as this like purely negative project, right? Like, that, we're just going to, we're just going to oppose the liberal establishment, but we don't actually agree on anything fundamentally. That was the critique. But, I think in a way what you're describing is that, actually sort of stepping outside of certain, certain of the kind of, the dead consensus is a term that my colleagues came up with to talk about the right, like to talk about the sort of fusionist, Reaganite right. And, there's a dead consensus of the left as well. So to kind of step out of these dead consensuses in the name of this kind of opposition to liberalism, left and right liberalism, in a surprising way, turns out to generate the space of greater, at least pluralism and kind of, we might say liberality in terms of being hospitable to different perspectives than is in fact in the case in sort of liberal media environments, which in theory are animated by these kind of values of sort of open debate and discourse, which, of course, most of them have like overtly or covertly abandoned in various ways in the past 10 years. But, so it's interesting. I mean, I'm reading this book by Louis Menand called The Free World. Have you encountered this?
No.
It's a kind of gargantuan sort of cultural and intellectual history of the post-war era. So, I mean, people like Lionel Trilling are sort of major figures in it. And, there are various things that are, and so it's kind of about different ideas about freedom that animated intellectuals and cultural figures in the West, kind of in the years after the Second World War, when the Cold War heated up. And so, you had the notoriously CIA-funded, Congresses for Cultural Freedom. You had all of these different kind of notions of freedom, whether coming from like the arts, where you had, these different artistic movements kind of liberating themselves from the constraints of tradition, whether in the world of kind of literature and journalism, where you had these kind of, the huge influence of sort of anti-communist liberalism, right? And so, I guess what's kind of interesting is that, at least in practice, I'd say, on behalf of Compact, that when you step outside of these very stifling consensuses, and I mean, it is important that this was, particularly on the part of my colleagues, a real, in a way that was maybe difficult for people not on the right to see, was really, represented a significant break with the right and with various versions of the right. And so, the point is, once you step outside of these consensuses, which we could consider to be different versions of a kind of broader liberal consensus, what opens up is a space of greater sort of intellectual freedom and plurality. So, that's a sort of more positive way to see it. I don't necessarily have like a good account of why that is, except that, we can just see that these institutional realms have become, I mean, it's just kind of boring to make this point, but, have become, completely sealed from any, serious internal dissensus. And, that let me just make another point in response to your original question, and then I'll let you follow up. But clearly the major story of the media in recent years has kind of been, on one hand, the congealment of these very stifling consensuses, which have then generated this counter reaction, which we might think of as Substack. But, even before that, you had these outlets like Quillette and these other kinds of, variously defined sort of classical liberal outlets that were, kind of explicitly designed to be able to, engage in with these sort of heresies that were no longer permissible to publish in most mainstream outlets. And so, but I think what a lot of those lack is an interest in political economy, like an interest in the relationship between, the relationship between sort of superstructure and base in a sort of Marxian sense. That they're pretty much all superstructure, and they tend to be caught up in these kind of, these very simulacral battles over, I mean, in a way, they're kind of stuck in the same realm of like battling over representation, right? That the left is, because that's kind of what sets their terms. And so I think they're not, my critique of most of those outlets is that they, in a sense, they're kind of nostalgists, right? They want to return to like the 1990s or whatever, which, I sort of do too, but, also like, you need to have an analysis of why things evolved in the way that they did, that goes beyond like, some people had some bad ideas and influenced other people to have those bad ideas. And that's kind of my idée fixe for like the past however many years, which I've, ranted about to whoever would listen. And, one reason I joined Compact was I felt I had found people who shared this concern, right? Like all these sort of anti-woke outlets have a severe limitation because they don't really go deeper than these kind of issues of cultural representation.
Yeah.
And they don't really go deeper than just sort of, defending these sort of lost liberal principles, but that they're also not really interested in like looking into like the history of to what extent those, and like when and how those actually came to exist in the ways that they did for the time that they were prevalent, and then like what the factors are that erode and weaken them. So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but at least two stabs at it.
Yeah. So everybody who writes for Compact is a critic of liberalism.
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose so. Although even there, I'm kind of, the term liberalism. I mean, so are we critics of liberalism because it's liberalism, or are we critics of liberalism because it has become illiberal? Right. That's a major dividing line, I think, within this whole sort of heterodox sphere. Right. Because there's a clear cohort for whom the problem with contemporary liberalism is that it is not actually liberal, right? Because it's abandoned various, and I mean, it's interesting to see, we published this piece by Julius Krein of American Affairs recently that's about, somewhat wonky topic of ESG investing. But I guess what's kind of interesting there is you see like a version of a thing playing out on the right that's kind of parallel to these like debates about free speech on the left, which is sort of that, there's this conception of a kind of procedural neutrality that should govern investing, which is, this sort of, Milton Friedman conception of like, the only duty of the corporation is to,
make
increase
money.
Profits for the shareholder, right? And so, there's that idea of just kind of a neutral procedural mechanism, right? And so the standard conservative critique is that of ESG investing is that, that's been distorted by these political ideologies, right? That have sort of infested the investment world. So it's like it resembles, the sort of notion that okay, so, at some point we had like free speech and everybody accepted that. And then, these bad people came in and said that free speech was actually harmful to vulnerable people or whatever. And then people stopped having free speech. I mean, so what Krein does in the piece is kind of show that the notion of procedural neutrality built in this kind of model of the market that comes out of the sort of Friedman school is always, and I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but is always itself political, right, and ideological. And so these notions of procedural neutrality are often a kind of they're a sort of ahistorical fantasy, right? And so I think just generally trying to publish people who go beyond that level of debate, in the way that I think Krein does, in terms of kind of a current debate on the right, where basically some people are like, well, if wokeness is taking over an industry, then we just have to like let the market correct it, right? That, go woke, go broke, and then it'll all be fine. Like the market will work it out. Whereas then there's the other school on the right, which is like, no, we have to intervene and prevent these distortions from taking place. I think Krein's argument is ultimately that that's kind of a false opposition, right? And so I don't want to get, I'll let people read his explanation of why that is. But, I think it's a good illustration of the type of argument that I think we favor. Yeah.
It's neither left nor right, obviously, right? It's a critique of both, right? It's a critique of the wokeness in ESL or ESG. Right. it agrees with some of the right-wing critiques of ESG as being sort of a ridiculous imposition on business, et cetera, commerce. But it also says that the right-wing response to it, which is, the typical right-wing response, which is let the market figure it out, is itself a political construct. Right. That the Milton Friedman idea about what to do with big corporations is itself a political construct. It's not just some neutral thing out there.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So that's a very compact kind of thing to say. Now, I guess when you were saying that, I mean, I did, and by the way, I did read that article and I listened to that podcast about that article too. The thing that I'm noticing about compact, one of the things I'm noticing about compact is that, your authors tend not to be free market libertarian types. That's the one thing you're kind of missing, right?
That's true. That's a good point. It's like, it's like how the early free speech arguments is like, okay, everybody except the Catholics, right?
Yeah.
So we're like that, but everybody except for the free market. It's interesting because I think I mean, I don't know, we like I think we come at this from different perspectives. I mean, certainly on the kind of Catholic post-liberal side, there's there are various versions of the critique of free market economics, right? That really have a deep tradition in like the Vatican, that you can find like papal encyclicals going back to the 19th century, which are critiquing free market economics as it was being proposed and supported by elites then. So it's there's kind of a long very long Catholic tradition of that. Sure. As far as my own take on it, obviously I'm kind of more formed by Marxism, but then also by a kind of Polanyian sort of substantivist economics where okay, like I mean, I don't know that this is actually putting the cart before the horse, but there's a whole interesting school of French Girardian sort of political economists. And I know we're going to talk about Girard later, but who are kind of interesting in the way that they that it's not as unfavorable to free market economics as you might be. But it models it as a sort of political and cultural project whose function is a certain kind of social stabilization, right? And so if you're a Girardian, so what it's if you're Girardian, and again I'm putting the cart before the horse here, but like what are you concerned about? Well, you're concerned about the dangers of competitive mimetic conflict, right? Where basically people get caught up in competition over the same objects and thus become rivals, and so then if that's your framework, right, that's the fundamental problem that human societies have to solve, then there's, and this doesn't come directly from Girard, although he sort of hints at it in certain pieces. It's really fleshed out by a couple of other figures, including Paul Dumichel, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, André Orléans, and a few others. So there's kind of this whole French school of like economists who are proceeding from a Girardian perspective, right? And so the whole way they see the market is as a sort of social and political mechanism that functions to make competitive conflicts less dangerous, like less socially dangerous, but that like sacrifice before it, right? Like the sacrificial mechanisms that, according to the Girardian account, are sort of the original means of social stabilization that societies enjoyed. It has a violent, like it contains violence in both senses, right? That's the phrase. So the market contains violence in that it prevents a certain spiraling out of violence in various ways that might occur otherwise, but it also contains violence in that it does violence, right? Because it produces victims, right? And those victims are essentially the poor, the sort of, social refuse that is produced by the sort of by the kind of very formal functioning of sort of creative destruction through the market itself,
So,
right?
like the losers in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think I've gone off on a tangent, but so I have, but I guess your question was about free market. So I have like a very weird perspective on it, which is kind of formed by that Girardian take. I'm not, I enjoy like reading libertarian publications, like Reason and so on. I like some of those people. I mean, I tend to, the thing I most dislike about free market libertarianism is the notion. I mean, so, the reason I like the account that I just gave is because it roots the market in, real and deep human social tendencies, right? So it's not just some kind of like completely artificial invention, as some leftists seem to think, right? That like, becomes the kind of source, foncit origo of all evil. Instead, it's a reflection of, the problems that society's faced, and it's a particular kind of social and political mechanism that responds to those problems. It's not but it's neither the natural one, right? And this is like, I think just, I mean, I remember a long time ago reading, before I got involved in some of this other stuff, but the very beginning of David Graeber's book about debt, where he kind of, he points out this, like, the myth of barter, right? This, which is kind of the fairy tale that underlies a lot of kind of classical economics, right? That that you have to have economic exchange, because otherwise, human societies would not be efficient, right? You would not be able to obtain all the goods that you need to subsist. And like, the basic point Graeber makes is like, we have a huge trove of anthropological evidence, like, the circumstances in which, like, basically that thing has never, as far as we can tell, happened, right, in human history. It's like the social contract myth.
Right.
Like, people have, the only times when it's happened has been periods of crisis, when like normal functionings of society have been suspended or made impossible. But basically, exchange without, I mean, it's well understood in anthropology that exchange without money is extremely normal across human history and societies, right? Because the fundamental means of exchange is gift exchange, right, rather than economic exchange in the modern sense. And so, I sort of dislike the like metaphysics or whatever of free market libertarianism, where there's kind of this notion that, like, just the natural form of human society is to engage in economic exchange on the market. Right. So that's, I'd say, personally, the thing I object to about it. But there are also things I appreciate about libertarians. So
So I used to drink several cups of coffee every morning, and that worked for a while, until I developed an irregular heartbeat that was pretty scary. I went to my doctor and he said, you have to reduce your caffeine consumption, but I didn't know how to replace it, how to replace my morning coffee, until I found out earlier last year about Magic Mind, an amazing shot, you might call it an elixir, that contains several powerful nootropics and adaptogens that improve my energy, my focus, and my mood, all while reducing stress. Magic Mind is now part of my morning routine. It helps me stay focused with the right energy level, with no spike in cortisol and no heart racing. Magic Mind contains matcha from Japan, which boosts energy and contains 130 times the antioxidants of regular green tea. Ashwagandha from India, which supports the reduction of stress and anxiety. Lion's mane and cordyceps from British Columbia, which increase endurance and reduce inflammation, as well as vitamins B and D3, which support cognitive performance and boost the immune system. So go to magicmind.co/unregistered and use my discount code unregistered20 to get 40% off your first subscription of Magic Mind, or 20% off your first one-time purchase. My 40% off code only lasts for 10 days, so hurry now. Again, go to magicmind.co/unregistered and use my discount code unregistered20. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about the possibly latent hostility to libertarianism among compact people. And I think it makes a lot of sense why people at compact wouldn't be into libertarianism. So the magazine was founded by 2, am I right? Or 3 traditionalist Catholics, is that right?
2 and 1 sort of Marxist who then left, but
there you go. Right. So, but it's the traditionalist Catholics stayed on, and that's who hired you.
Yeah.
You come out of a Marxist background, as you've said. And that's who they're attracted. So these traditionalist Catholics have been attracted to these Marxist thinkers who they've employed to write for you. So that's who you see in the pages of Compact. As I said at the very beginning, you see the Marxist left, and then you see the sort of traditionalist right, the kind of paleo-conservative right, that I guess would be the broader term for this. And those are natural allies. And I think at the core of their objection to what is going on in the world, to the way society is arranged, is that, or to the free market, I should say, the free market conception of society, is that there's no place for community in it. Like, libertarians are not interested in community. That's just not a concern of theirs, you know.
Right.
They just want people to be free. And then they posit that once people are made to be free, they will naturally move toward, mutually beneficial exchange, et cetera. Right. It's a natural, as you were saying, it's a natural progression in the libertarian mind, toward the market, toward market relations.
Yeah.
So the traditionalist paleocon right says, no, as a matter of fact, and this is from Karl Marx says this too. I mean, Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto says the most disruptive influence in the history of the world is the free market. It upturns society. It's the most revolutionary thing that's ever happened. It's the revolutionary destructive force that annihilates tradition. I mean, he doesn't use quite that word, but those are basically the words he's using in the Communist Manifesto to describe capitalism. And for him, for Marx, it's largely positive. It gets rid of sort of the old superstitions of the past, et cetera. It lifts up the poor to be literate and to have, decent material lives and all that. But it destroys tradition and community that comes from tradition. So that is why true conservatives, from Burke onward to the guys now running Compact Magazine with you, that's why those people, that tradition, have been very hostile to the market. And it makes perfect sense to me. I get it. Marxists, their objections to the market are better known, but it makes sense that ultimately what Marxists are at least purportedly going for is this grand community of all people. At the end of the road, at the end of the historical process, once feudalism and then capitalism and then socialism have been done away with, we will have this one big communistic society in which everybody cooperates and gets along fabulously. So they're both community on the right over here and on the left over there, the Marxists and the paleocons, traditionalists. They're ultimately interested in community over against the individual, I would say, or over and against the individual's concerns or interests. So am I right? Is that what's going on at Compact in sort of general terms, that there's a communitarian commitment that makes it at least skeptical of free market and libertarian ideas, and that's why you don't have writers for Reason magazine in your magazine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's roughly right. I would say that, another strain that we do definitely have represented is, would seem at odds with some of what you're suggesting, which is, I'd say, a sort of modernist strain, which is that, and this is why I sort of say the paleocon doesn't quite I mean, paleocons, I guess they're like the Chronicles magazine people or whatever. I guess like one or two of them have written for us. But I think there's there are aspects of that particularly in the present context, kind of blend into this stuff that I've just found, all the kind of trad stuff and the sort of, whether it's like, the sort of seed oils or the, ball tanning or the, LARPing its fucking homesteaders stuff. Like I've gone from finding some of that, like, at least sort of entertaining to just finding it incredibly annoying recently. Like I find it like pretty much intolerable. Like I find basically this kind of elements of the very online right that, it's all caught up in these fantasies of return to some traditional community. It's like, it's completely, it's just laughable. And it's also just, it's like repeating all the mistakes of like 70s back to the land hippies, basically. Like literally, it's as if they're, they like generated a checklist and like they're going through every single one, right? So it's, so that stuff is just kind of embarrassing. I and like super cringe, and I would not want to ever be associated with it or be involved with a project that is. But on a more positive note, like I think one thing that we're, we published a piece celebrating the 8 billionth human being, right?
Yeah, so I saw that.
Celebrating population growth.
Yeah.
And it was a very robust, defense of modernization, development, and material improvement, right? And so we, are generally interested in publishing people who are kind of opposed to the sort of, doomerism side of environmentalism, right? Like, I think we're interested in publishing people who, don't think that these issues are nothing, but who also, basically think that it's possible to, generate new technologies that will improve life for all. And so, yeah, there is this kind of interesting, so this is like, I'm going to segue here into another observation, which I think is, I think part of why, maybe if I was like better at sort of being a sort of Marxist, I would like claim there's some kind of dialect, there's some need to like be dialectical here with all of these questions, whether about liberalism or anything else, because, before I said like, maybe the problem is that liberalism is illiberal, but in this case, what's kind of interesting is like there's kind of this notion that there are these reactionary oligarchs, right? That, Elon Musk, Thiel, Mark Andreessen, people like that. And, that there's kind of this faction of, I wrote something kind of about this, like called the War of Oligarchs back in spring when the Musk Twitter takeover was first being proposed. But, what's kind of interesting to me is like, I don't particularly admire these people. Particularly like, I don't particularly admire Musk. Thiel, we can get into, he's important in relation to the whole Girard story, but I think Musk is kind of a, I'm not a big fanboy, but, and I think the Neuralink thing is sinister. So, not all technological modernization is necessarily something I would get behind, but, but I do find it interesting that basically what these people have in common is that they're actually all interested in kind of recovering this Promethean project of the bourgeoisie, right? They're all interested in like, Mark Andreessen, like it's time to build, right? Thiel's whole thing, like in his book 0 to 1 and elsewhere, is like, we need to return to a period of genuine sort of, genuine technological progress, right? As opposed to this kind of pseudo technological progress of information technology, right? Which basically just, gives us, gives us more entertainment, but you know,
Mhm.
while the infrastructure rots around us and so on.
Mhm.
And you know, Andreessen's Time to Build, Thiel, the whole like we need 0 to 1 innovation thing, and Musk, despite being kind of an idiot, like, you know, I mean, I'm basically kind of pro space and all that kind of stuff. So like, at least he's kind of giving that some impetus. Like, I'm so I think something I'm kind of interested in is like the people who are actually trying to reclaim whether more as a LARP or genuinely this kind of, yeah, I mean, exactly what Marx describes as like the progressive function of the bourgeoisie, right, as this driver of historical transformation, which, you know, has to be seen dialectically as, you know, basically having both good and bad, you know, is not simply something to be sort of morally celebrated or condemned, but, you know, does is the force that propels society forward. And I mean, what's kind of interesting is like, you know, there's this interesting Marxist analysis that like the reason we have sort of secular stagnation is because the working class is defeated in the 70s, right, as a sort of political and historical agent.
Right.
And so what that does is it makes the bourgeoisie decadent, right, by depriving it of the force that, you know, essentially forces it to become dynamic, right, and forces it to engage in this constant flight forward. So, you know, I'm just throwing that out there, but, you know, something I find kind of interesting is like the relationship between these currents that are seen as reactionary, but then it's actually only in those realms that you see this kind of attempt to reclaim this progressive mission, right, of the I mean, and particularly the figure of the sort of, you know, the traditional bourgeois, right, who, you know, in some ways is sort of displaced in the 20th century by managerial sort of bureaucracy. But, you know, that you have these kind of figures at the commanding heights who, you know, whether in impressive ways or kind of ridiculous ways, as in Musk's reign on Twitter, like attempt to embody this kind of older figure of the capitalists, right, who actually directs things, right, who actually orients things, rather than being just kind of the figurehead behind this.
He's a father figure, right? He's the father figure, which is that's crucial for Christians. Right. I see.
But anyway, so I don't know. There's something interesting about I mean, and it's, you know, there are other directions we could go in this. It's like, how do you get the sort of Nick Land, like, you know, the sort of arch reactionary is also the accelerationist, right? So there's some kind of odd, there's another sort of horseshoe there or something, right? Where, if you, you know, if you think about paleoconservatism or whatever, too simplistically, you don't see the way that it actually links up with these other projects. So I don't know. So you know, part of what I'm saying is this is all extremely inchoate, I would argue, but I guess what's kind of interesting in being involved in it is just you know, seeing how it unfolds and where it goes. Not having a clear and you know, because we don't have a single sort of ideological orientation, right, it's sort of more interesting that way, because
but I think there is some coherence, and I guess that's what I'm trying to tease out here. And I think maybe at the base of it, and this leads right into our conversation about Renee Girard. At the base of it, I think, is Christianity, or a particular Christian ethic, or maybe a Christian sensibility. Maybe is at the base of what Compact is doing, and it is why there is a basic Christian sensibility that I think is shared, by both traditionalists and by Marxists. I mean, people have written about this, right? You know, how Marxism is secularized Christianity in a way. That certainly socialism, if not Marxism, but socialism depends upon the sacrifice of individuals, right? Self-sacrifice for the greater collective, for the greater good, for society, for the revolution, and then for the state, and then for, the communist society, the collective society. One must always sacrifice one's own interests and desires for the community. And that, that's socialism, which is the political project of Marxism. And that is also Christianity. I mean, is that not St. Paul in the epistle to Romans? I mean, is that not what he's saying? Is that, and all the subsequent major Christian theologians like Augustine, it's about sacrificing. That's the word they used. Often they would say your body, your members, they would say, your interests, your desires, your feelings, your ambitions, even to serve God, but to do that is to serve God's community, which again, that sounds very socialist to me. And so it does make sense to me on a certain level, if I'm right at all about this, that the traditionalist Catholics who run or who founded Compact would hire a Marxist like you to run the magazine.
And I would say I wouldn't say I'm a Marxist. I would say I'm sort of Marxist.
Post-Marxist.
Yeah. Just because, as we might get in, it's like, I think, part of how my brain works is so Girard is clearly not a Marxist, right?
Right.
It's very influential on me. I think part of how my brain works is like having these different kind of lodestars that like point me in very different directions is just, part of how I sort of keep things interesting as I try to think about the world. I'll say one other thing just about what you just said, which is, just to be provocative. I mean, it's interesting you say that because in some ways, so we just published a piece called After Populism, which I definitely recommend to people. It's one of the more provocative pieces we've run, I would say. And I won't get into everything it argues, but one point it makes, it actually makes an argument that the politics of self-interest is actually preferable to the politics of sort of other interest or of kind of, and particularly that historically the politics of a certain kind of politics of oligarchic self-interest. And this kind of goes with my point about progressive bourgeoisie is like, has been, has carried great positive externalities. And so the objects of analysis here are like the Whig government that ruled England through much of the, the period of its kind of immense economic growth in the 18th into 19th century, right, where you essentially had a long period of one-party rule by the Whigs, right, who basically represented new money, to put it simply, right? Yep. And then you had a similar kind of, arrangement in various other kind of modernizing, industrializing nations, including Japan in the Meiji period, Germany in the 19th century. And that, what united these periods was having a kind of a highly and sort of self-consciously self-interested sort of progressive oligarchic class that saw a reflection of its own interest in the improvement of the nation as a whole, right? Basically in the growth of industry and the creation of a nation that is relatively sort of autarkic and able to sustain itself as a sort of industrial power. And so anyway, that's just one facet of the argument, but it's an interesting case where he's actually sort of arguing against this politics of sacrifice, as you described it, or of a kind of altruistic orientation, which I have to say I've sort of become sympathetic to because I've become so suspicious of the left's version of it in recent years, that I'm actually like more, part of what I thought was interesting about COVID politics was, the people who like organized sort of locally to like lobby for schools to be reopened and things like that, right? That was a kind of social movement that was driven by a self-interest that was also, it was driven by direct self-interest, right? It was these people relied on these services, needed these services, and therefore, organized as a political force to, demand that these services which they, pay taxes to fund be restored, right?
Yep.
And that's a perfectly self-interested project, and was even sort of, maligned on the left for that, right? It's sort of like, oh, these are just like,
Exactly.
upper middle class suburbanites, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, to me, there's something interesting there, which is that, in my analysis, the things they were asking for were the correct things for the society as a whole.
Mhm.
And so there was not a misalignment between the two,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, I'm sort of interested in what are the contexts in which political self-interest, which often has a bad name, can actually be seen as a sort of positive and progressive force, as opposed to this kind of, so the piece talks about, it uses this term cratophobia, which is, the fear of power, the fear of ruling, right? Where, which we can see in various simple cases of like all these politicians we elect who want to claim that they don't actually have power, or for various reasons and in various ways, either because they want to claim that they're still one of the people, or because they want to claim like, oh, well, I can't really do anything about this.
Mhm.
And, they want to claim that they're the underdogs, like that they're opposed to the establishment, even though they have been elected to it. So like, there's something about that connects to this, where, the politics of a sort of disavowed, and I guess the other interesting thing is like, the relationship between avowed versus disavowed self-interest, right? Like, a disavowed self-interest where you sort of claim that what you're doing is altruistic, but in fact, it does, benefit your class or your particular cohort.
Right.
Like that's a very common thing we see as well.
Right. Well,
Anyway.
okay. So that's a compact. So there's a compact article that actually argues for self-interest, which is
That's part of it. Yeah.
which is sympathetic to a major piece of libertarian thinking. So I'm trying to pigeonhole you, but you're evading it. But the other thing that joins together the two major ways of thinking represented by compact is evangelism. So Christianity kind of begins this, right? Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, go out and convert all other nations. He says that to his disciples. And then, of course, Marxism and socialism has been highly evangelical throughout its history, calling always for a global revolution. All people should and must rise up and overthrow capitalism and bring about a new age of collective utopia. So is that something? That seems to me, though, to be something that compact is not so interested in, and your writers are not so interested in, and maybe skeptical of, that evangelical tendency that has been on both the Christian right and on the left.
Well, we want to convert people to read compact, but beyond that, there isn't. I'd say we're pretty explicit, despite having two sort of Catholic founders who are known for that, about not being a Catholic publication, right? So that's significant. That they may themselves be Catholic, but that's not the sort of aim of the publication.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's a trickier one. Maybe it would be easier to go through. If we could just get into Girard, that might kind of loop back to this question about, because I think in a way his take on that is a bit more is not is surprising in certain ways. So.
Yeah. Okay. So the title of your piece is, am I right? It's Renee Girard and something like the rise of victim power. Is that right? The rise of victim power. So people listening will undoubtedly know what we're talking about when we say that victimhood has become valorized in our society in recent decades. I'd like to actually talk about how long this phenomenon has been around. of venerating, valorizing the people who we deem to have been oppressed.
Right.
And you start off with a discussion, of course, of the biggest victim of recent years, George Floyd, the most celebrated victim, who is made not just into a victim, but a martyr, of course, and a saint-like or Jesus-like figure. People know that, and they see it all around. It's not just George Floyd. We know that if you can convince the establishment, the cultural establishment, that you are in fact a victim, they will put you at the front. and they will raise you up, and they will organize a movement around you. And that's what happened with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and Black people, generally speaking, right? This is our ever present, ever handy victims we have always with us is Black people. Trans people too, gays before them, others, but Black people are eternal victims that we always use and love so much because they're victims. So Girard had an explanation for this, why this happens in our society, that he developed beginning in the 1970s, long before any of the people that you and I know today were talking about this cult of victimhood. So let's go through it. There's a few pieces of this. There's a logical chain in his argument that we have to follow. So let's go through it. So how on earth, why is it that we have this tendency in our society to venerate and valorize the victim figure? And I know it starts with there's a sub thesis here that we have to start with about mimetic desire, but can we just go through this from the top?
I mean, so first of all, just diverting things a little bit, I would say that, Girard specifically says that, this part of his argument is found in a kind of inverted form already in Nietzsche, right?
Right.
Because for Nietzsche, what happens basically with Judaism and Christianity in particular is, what he calls the slave rebellion and morality, right?
Right.
So the argument here is that, basically you have the original form of moral evaluation, according to Nietzsche, is that, those who are powerful, who are strong, who are, if we imagine like a warrior society, right? Mm-hmm. In this society, those who are powerful, who are strong, etc., regard themselves as good, right? As virtuous, as possessing of all these positive qualities. And then, they, as a result of that, they have no compunction. I don't know if you saw like the Northman.
Not yet.
It's kind of a good representation of this sort of thing, but like, they just have no compunction about like pillaging and enslaving, and they're just, they behave in ways that we today would consider sociopathic, right? Which is like, they'll just go into a village, as you see in the Northman, and like herd all the people into a hut and then like set it on fire, right? And then like take the ones they want, enslave them,
mm-hmm.
And just drag them around with them, rape them, whatever, right? So this is like, the Nietzschean argument is that this is sort of and there is a moral code there, right? But the moral code is that, there are basically the people who have these positive qualities, and then there are the people who lack them and who basically don't matter, right? Who can just be treated as this kind of refuse. And that's obviously an oversimplification, right? But so the slave rebellion and morality is that, according to Nietzsche, that at some point you have, forms in which these underclasses, right, who are heavily oppressed and mistreated and subjected to all sorts of violence in these sort of societies, manage to find ways to assert themselves, right? And they do this sort of through ideology and religion, right? And what they do is sort of say that, all of the things that, if you're a great man in these societies, right, you can enjoy all the, whatever wine, women, plunder, etc. you want. So what they do is, one move is this kind of asceticism where like actually enjoying these things is bad, right? So enjoying these things becomes seen as evil, right? It becomes seen as as sin, right?
Yep.
And it becomes seen as noble not to be one of these great men who is, striding about the world, kind of exerting power, but instead to be the downtrodden, right? To be,
Yes.
and so, this is the basic inversion that Nietzsche describes in the Genealogy of Morality, that he associates specifically with Christianity, right? And he says he sees it in other religions have sort of versions of it. Buddhism has a kind of version of it.
Yep.
Where it says, where it defines life as all about suffering.
Yep.
So it kind of vindicates the experience of the downtrodden by saying, like, actually, all those things that they seem to be enjoying are just illusions anyway.
Right.
So,
and poverty becomes a virtue.
Poverty becomes a virtue, but
it's good to be poor.
Nietzsche, the Christian version of this is, from his perspective, is particularly virulent and sort of poisonous, because it essentially becomes the source of all. I mean, so first of all, it's, he sees it as, it's a complex argument, right? Because he's, as opposed to how some of these kind of, right-wing people who like Nietzsche would, he has a kind of appreciation for this intellectual revolution that is the slave rebellion and morality, right? He sees it as, in some ways, not exactly necessary, but it's a kind of intellectual advance in the history of humanity, right? And so, in any case, that's sort of where some idea of victim power would first be clearly articulated, right? Or some idea that there is this new form of power which differs absolutely, or kind of inverts the previous model of power, right? Which we can think of as being. If we just go back to these societies where all of these kind of hierarchies and brutalities and so on were largely accepted, we tend to be shocked by them, right? So why is that? Well, basically because we're all Christian, right, in our sensibility, right? We've ultimately, over 2,000 years, sort of internalized this new sense of things. So, so Girard is really working from that account, right? So he's very influenced by Nietzsche, as are many French intellectuals of his generation, but in a sort of different way. And so, in a sense for Girard, so now I'll sort of take you through his own, the steps by which he gets to this, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, I said before, he argues that the primary problem that human societies must address is violence, right? Is how to, and so this is basically the same starting point as like Hobbes, right? And sort of social contract theory, right? How do you create harmony between people? But it's also a rejection of social contract theory, because what it says is that there's a kind of spontaneous emergent process that is simply deeply built into and sort of emerges out of the hypermemetic nature of human beings, right? Which is what sets us apart and from our closest primary relatives and makes us cultural beings, right? Who basically acquire most of what makes us who we are by imitation. In other words, by reproducing cultural patterns that pre-exist us, right? So for us to be that way, we have to be hypermemetic, right? We have to be able to, we have to have a sort of cognition that is capable of a high degree of imitation. But the result of this is that we become easily embroiled in conflict because this also applies to desire. So if I have something or want something, then somebody else will also respond to that mimetically, and therefore, some conflict will emerge between us. Now, the next stage of this is that there is this spontaneous emergent process, which is the scapegoat mechanism, right?
Okay, pause for a second. Sorry. So the mimetic desire thing, I want to stay on that for just a second. So Girard says, am I right, that we learn our desires from others,
right?
So this we got to talk about this for a second. So back to I do not identify as a libertarian, but I think they have a lot of good points. So I'm not bringing them up constantly because I am a libertarian, but because I think they're a good counterpoint to what Girard is saying here. According to some libertarian economists, there's this thing they call consumer sovereignty, which is that the desires of the individual consumer determine basically what is produced in the marketplace, and that they cannot, that no matter how much a capitalist advertises and promotes their products, they can't sort of convince you to want the thing. I mean, they might nudge you, they might put this shiny new thing in front of you, but your pre-existing desires that are your own will eventually find what they want, right? And so what capitalists must do is not convince you to want things, but find out what you want, right? So this is a libertarian economist thesis, which I think is pretty fun, and I like it. And I've been writing with that thesis for many years now. Girard says, no, this is totally bullshit, right? It's that all of our desires are simply learned from others, and we simply mimic or imitate their desires. That's how we choose to do what we want to do in life. Is this right? Is this what he said? Is this his claim?
So if we should just define desire precisely, because the point of desire in this context is that it is not need. Right. It's desire,
right.
is metaphysical, right? It's not, it doesn't pertain to the realm of kind of, bodily needs, right? So desire, and this is like a common thing in modern French thought, right? That desire is kind of this specifically human thing, right? And it sort of comes out of a reading of Hegel and blah, blah, blah. But basically desire is precisely what we have by virtue of being humans that makes us. And so the point is, like, we don't need to explain why people want to eat. Although we might need to explain why some people, fast for 40 days or whatever, which would go back to the rise of asceticism.
Right.
And so that is like, we need to explain why people would choose to not eat, right? Or why they would choose to abstain from sex. Like there's a question of desire that, that goes beyond, what can be explained on the level of animal need. But, we could also say, well, what we need to figure out is why desire attaches itself to particular objects, right? Than other objects. And so I guess one explanation, which maybe would be the libertarian one, would be that there's just some kind of innate, individual self that, sovereignly, chooses these things in a sort of somewhat arbitrary way. But I just don't think that's I think the case for the Girardian version is it's just not a very good description of like how any of the stuff actually happens, right? People, and if you just think about how, companies try to advertise things, it tends to be, if you think of like the role that now sort of social media and like influencer marketing and things like that plays, where, this is seen as superior to its predecessors because it taps into that imitative tendency, right? It's like you see someone who you want to be, right? And then you realize that by obtaining some particular product or object, you can be that person, right? And that's another way in which it's metaphysical. It's a desire for being and not just for the thing. And so I think if you just look at how consumption actually functions, it tends to function in something like this way, right? You sort of acquire some kind of image externally of what or who you want to be, and then you acquire things that allow you to approximate that.
Well, how about this? This might be a critique of the consumer sovereignty thesis. The desires expressed in the 20th century were in patterns, broad patterns. Large numbers of people, hundreds of millions of people at a time, expressed desires for particular things. In the 19th century, broad, swaths of people express desires for very different things, which suggests that they are culturally, the desires, consumer interests are culturally determined, which now that's more Foucault talking, right? That would be the Foucauldian critique of this, I think. that we get our ideas about what we want, not from some pure little, wellspring deep inside of our soul that is just ours and untouched by the outside world, but that, everything basically we think and want and need or think we need comes from outside of us. We're surrounded by things and people expressing desires for those things, and we learn to want those things through that mimesis.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be one way of attacking it, but that's more Foucauldian. So Girard is, if we learn our desires from other people and that we are simply imitating other people when we express desires, does he see, because he is interested in eternal stuff, he's into the grand narratives, this is why he's so different from the French postmodernists, is there something to him that is eternal in people's desires?
Mm-hmm. I think the answer is it's sort of the structure of it, but not the content, right? And this is like the way he really, and this is, I think an angle from which he can be critiqued, right? Because he really breaks from Freud in this regard, right? Because, he sort of takes, he takes the structure from Freud, but then, sort of evacuates the content. So like, if you think of the Oedipal triangle, right? There's the father, the son, and the mother. That's basically the structure of what he calls triangular mimetic desire, right? The father possesses the mother, the child then becomes rival of the father because the father possesses the thing that he wants and sort of models his desire for it. And so, this is the sort of nature of Oedipal conflict. So for Girard, you can just take out the particular contents of that and just apply it to any kind of relationship, right? And particularly, the prominence of sort of the love triangle as a sort of form of romantic relationship, right? And in literature, where it in a sense becomes the kind of, and this is, one of his earliest kind of insights, that, the typical form of the romantic relationship in sort of modern literature becomes the love triangle, right? And so the line from the subject to the object of desire is always kind of triangulated in this way, or is not always triangulated in this way, but is typically triangulated in this way, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And so I think that's, so what's continuous is the structure of it, right?
Okay.
And then, I think we can say like, there's sort of a difference between, we could turn to like the 10 Commandments here and say, well, it turns out that all these, the 10 Commandments culminates with the prohibition on coveting your neighbor's, wife, et cetera, et cetera. In a way, many of them have to do with this kind, prohibiting this sort of desire, right? Because in his analysis, they're based on this perception, right? That this is the fundamentally destabilizing function, right? Now, we might think of like the prohibition on coveting your neighbor's wife is one thing. And then, the sort of modern, there's this modern phrase of like keeping up with the Joneses, right? The Joneses are your neighbors. So, you keep up with them by coveting not necessarily Mrs. Jones, but by coveting, their car, so, this is a way that sort of consumer society creates a certain potential for diffusing this kind of conflict, because it makes objects reproducible, right? So you can actually have the same thing as somebody else without you having to be in conflict with them. But the problem is that, as you might think of like in a teenage context, this also kind of determines, so like, it's not quite true that just because consumer products are, infinitely reproducible, although there is also all of this artificial scarcity that's produced to make competition, to create competition among consumers. But, because it doesn't mean that there can't be conflict over them, right? Because if you just think of like a teenage situation where, some cool kid who's like a trend leader obtains some commodity, right, that sets them apart and gives them some kind of status, right? But then, once somebody imitates that, like imitates their desire and obtains the same object, I can actually create conflict between them, right? Because because the person who started it will be mad that the other person has it,
right?
Then it sort of can still become a source of conflict because of that role of sort of being and not just having, right? That in some ways, because these products kind of are seen as reflecting who we are, someone else having it can actually create a kind of crisis of identity for me, right?
Sure.
Where I'm, okay, if that other person who I think is lame has that thing too, then what is it that makes me, right? But anyway, that's so I mean, the point is this potential for conflict, even if there isn't a kind of scarcity, or it doesn't depend on scarcity, right? It can arise in relation to scarcity, in particular in a romantic context where there's just one woman, right? She's inherently singular, and so the potential for conflict is almost sort of infinite there, but it's still obtained in situations of non-scarcity.
When you say conflict, you're talking about competition, right?
Yes.
When so you express it, you demonstrate a desire for something, for X thing. I see you want the thing. I then imitate that. I want the thing now. This is mimetic desire, right? But now the problem is there's two of us wanting the same thing, and there's only so much of the thing out there. And sometimes there's imposed scarcity too, to make the thing even less available. So we now suddenly you and I are in this, even though we want the same thing and I was imitating you, flattering you by wanting what you wanted. Now we're in competition over getting the thing, which could be a woman or it could be a BMW, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the point is sort of that, and this is really a speculative account of, I mean, again, it's like social contract theory in that it tries to go back to some kind of primordial moment, right?
Yeah, right.
Where these kind of conflicts first begin to arise among emergent human societies, like through the process of human evolution, right? And that the argument is that the process by which these conflicts are resolved is what creates human culture, right? And so that process is that you have a kind of, so on one hand, if these conflicts can lead to violence, in particularly, if we imagine situations in which there's no state monopoly on violence, right? And so here, think of like, the sort of Sicilian mafia movies or whatever, like, well, what do you have? You have basically people competing over certain objects and, coming into conflict, killing each other. Then once that has happened, there has to be a retaliation. The violence itself begets a mimetic response, right? It produces more violence. And so, I mean, the example I came up with when I was teaching the course on Girard, which I think is kind of interesting, is here's a juxtaposition. The opening scene of No Country for Old Men, both the book and the novel, is basically the scene of like, he finds a circular firing squad, basically, right? Of these people who are fighting over this drug money or whatever, and they literally just slaughter each other, right? So the point is, like, in the Girardian account, this is sort of a real potential. And so if we think about the myths about apocalypse, about the end of the world, I mean, the argument is that what they describe are things that really happened, right? Where societies essentially consumed themselves in this sort of violence, in this sort of reciprocal violence, right? And so this is a thing that can happen, right? That a society can become a circular firing squad and destroy itself in this way, right? But, then the thing that saves that, can forestall that event is if all of the violence can be directed towards this one figure, right?
Right.
And so, I don't know, I feel like we could go on for longer than I have if I were to get it too deeply into this, but, there's this question of, how exactly did this come about? I mean, Girard is heavily reliant on, mythology and ethnography here, but like, it's the figure of the scapegoat has to be a kind of liminal figure, has to be kind of both on the inside, but also kind of on the margins of it. It can be both someone who is socially marginal or someone who is quite socially prominent.
Okay.
And so, and what's interesting is in myth, I mean, the Oedipus example is probably the readiest to hand, but you know, that in myth you have these figures who embody these seemingly opposite attributes, right? They're both outsiders and insiders. They're kind of both at the bottom of, or at least at some point in the story at the bottom of the social scale, but also at the top. You know, so this is kind of a common sort of figure, right? You know, it's and so the point is, you know, you have some figure who's able to attract the violence that threatens to consume the society towards him or herself, and that, you know, this results in a kind of unanimous immolation, destruction, murder, whatever, lynching of this figure, right? Which then, I mean, there's an interesting, you know, there's some passages where he talks about like the first pyramids are like the piles of stone over the body of a victim of a stoning, right? So, you know, we can think of the prominence of stoning as a means of collective lynching in the Bible and in ancient cultures. So what happens? Well, you know, this figure is stoned, right? It's covered with stones, and what you end up with there is a structure, right?
Yeah.
Over this body has been built a structure, right? So it's kind of a nice metaphor for the point of this process, which is that, you know, then that structure can become a kind of center around which the society kind of gathers itself, right?
Yeah.
So here again, there's a sort of continuation of an idea that's developed by Freud in Totem and Taboo, right? Where he argues that, you know, that you have this kind of primordial version of human society where you have this father figure who basically monopolizes all the women. Interestingly, you know, if you look at like polygamist cults in the West, they tend to kind of have this structure, right? Where there's like this figure of the primal father who, like, you know, is sort of molesting all of these 12-year-old girls and then expelling the younger boys to prevent sexual competition. He's expelling the younger boys from the society, right? And casting them out. So anyway, sorry, that's a detour, but, you know, the point there is that, you know, for Freud, there's kind of this founding murder, right? The primal father is killed ultimately by the younger men. And then the result of this is that, you know, he becomes the kind of God figure who, in a sense, you know, inspires guilt, but also, you know, in his sort of virtual continued presence, functions as a sort of, you know, superegoic figure or whatever. But so the Girardian version of this is not quite that, right? It's that this figure of the scapegoat is transfigured into a god because of the sort of cathartic effect produced by their lynching, right? So in other words, the lynching transfigures them into the figure of a god, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so this is a kind of genesis of transcendence, right? So what it does is it creates a kind of symbolic entity who can, you know, sort of represent the society and sort of orient it, right? And so, you know, he again is heavily reliant on mythology, which, you know, frequently involves stories about gods being, and this is why, like, in the 19th century, you had figures like Fraser who were sort of like, oh, actually the Christian narrative is nothing particularly unique because all of world mythology is full of these stories of gods who are killed, right? Who are collectively murdered, right? So this is this idea that, you know, that there's a relationship between a kind of ritual sacrificial killing and the genesis of a god is kind of all over mythology. So Girard's argument is that this is a representation of a kind of real social process. Though we can see kind of attenuated versions of still happening today, right? But what does not happen is the genesis of gods, right? We have a sort of weaker version of that maybe with the George Floyd case, which is
that's what I'm getting at.
We can get into, but
yeah.
So in any case, the argument he makes, you know, beyond that is that this process kind of installs itself as like the operating system of human societies. They engage in these kind of purges, which are sort of ritualized in sacrifice, where you have just extremely widespread human sacrifice across much of the ancient world, across a wide range of societies. And this simply goes on for a long time, right? And it develops and evolves in various ways, differently in different societies. In certain cases, human victims are substituted with animal victims. But nevertheless, the need for some kind of symbolic violence that is some kind of symbolic act of violence that sort of reproduces this effect, right, is what's, and it can happen both in sort of preset and ritualized ways, or in ways that are more spontaneous at moments of crisis, right? So once we get into sort of so what we see and this relates again to the slave rebellion and morality, what we see already in like the book of Genesis is a concern with who the victims of these sort of immolations and lynchings are, right? And a sort of taking of the perspective of that figure, right? Who is, this is not an uncommon way of thinking about sort of the Hebrew scriptures, right? That they're sort of, they're unique among ancient mythologies in the degree to which they favor the underdog. They take the perspective of the underdog, right? So if we think about like the figure of Joseph, right, he's sort of repeatedly scapegoated,
right.
But he's always kind of vindicated in a way, right? I mean, interestingly, he's scapegoated by his brothers. He's sort of falsely Me Too'd by his employer's wife. And but he always but the whole story is kind of about how he manages to extricate himself from these situations, like where he's about to be lynched, essentially, right? So that there are various versions of this, but basically throughout the Bible we start getting this this kind of Girard also argues this kind of deconstruction of this mechanism, right? Then the argument is sort of that what we finally get in the Gospels is a kind of a sort of systematic dismantling of the scapegoat narrative, because of the assertion of the sort of total innocence of Christ, right?
Yeah.
Because I missed a step in all of this, because the point here is partly that the sort of ideological mechanism that's required for the scapegoat mechanism to occur is that people have to believe that the scapegoat is responsible for the conflicts that are consuming the community, right? Okay. So they have to believe that in order for the lynching to actually work its effects, right? To actually bring about peace, because they have to believe that here's an interesting, like, sort of anthropological piece of evidence for this is just, if you look at kind of what, witch hunts are usually associated with like early modern Europe, but they're very widespread across different cultures, and they can take different forms. But what they have in common is the idea that this figure is somehow, the figure of the witch is, guilty of some kind of taboo, right, violation, and that taboo violation has brought about the catastrophe that's afflicting the community. Wow. And therefore, once the witch or whoever is expelled, that plague or disaster can be lifted, right? And so this is this is Oedipus, right? He's guilty of violating these taboos, and therefore his expulsion from the community enables it to extricate itself from the plague. It's going back to the Bible, like the book of Jonah, right? He's sort of he's on this it's another version of this, like he's he's disobeyed God. He gets on this boat. There's a terrible storm, right? And the people on the boat say, the thing that's causing the storm is, somebody on here did something wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we're in the middle of this crisis. And so they throw him overboard, right?
Right.
And so again, what's important here is that Jonah, like Joseph, both seen traditionally as prefigurations of Christ, right? Manages to, I get swallowed by the whale and then spat out onto shore.
Mm-hmm.
So he manages to survive this, kind of typical act of sacrificial scapegoating, and the story essentially takes his side and gives him an opportunity to, redeem what he's done. But the point here in all of this is that, first of all, the scapegoat becomes no longer seen from the perspective of the lynchers, the victimizers, right? For whom the scapegoat is both initially this kind of uncanny figure of violation of taboo, of kind of destabilization of the society, but then once they have undergone once they have been lynched or expelled,
Mm-hmm.
they can become transfigured into a god figure, right? Because they have rescued the society through their own sort of transfiguration, right? But what all these biblical texts do is look at the same narrative from the perspective of the victim, right? So they tell the same story, but simply shift the perspective.
Right.
And so the argument is that by doing this, they kind of short circuit the sort of, essentially kind of contagious mob mentality that is, and I mean, just to get a little bit contemporary, like, it's always interesting to me that people like who form these kind of mobs on Twitter or whatever, like they really need to believe in the guilt of the people, and they really need to reassert it, right? So if you think about I don't know, like Nick Sandman, like the Covington, right? Like people, to this day, they still kind of have to believe that he did something wrong, right? In order to kind of continue their membership in the collective that they're part of, right? So there is this kind of need for your scapegoats have to actually be guilty of the thing they're accused of, in order for the kind of the collective that coalesces in the act of scapegoating to maintain its coherence, right? And it's when that becomes more problematic that form of kind of collective identity becomes, starts to break down, right?
Right. So I want to finish here by going to the beginning of your piece, because I'm still having a hard time understanding how the summer of 2020, where you begin your piece, the summer of 2020, you're attempting to explain sort of what happened there with the sainthood of George Floyd. How the Girardian thesis can help us understand why the summer of 2020 happened the way that it did, right? So, there was obviously lots of conflict in our society then, which Girard would say was a result of conflict or competition over our shared desires, which we've learned from one another. Okay. And the way that conflict gets resolved is ultimately George Floyd is made into the victim, hero, martyr, but I'm missing some steps there.
It doesn't, I would say it doesn't get resolved. It's sort of punctuated by that moment, right? Which I suppose what's interesting is there's no unanimity, right? And so, the other point is that there's a kind of inversion, right? Floyd is sort of an inverted scapegoat, because the point is that he's sort of sanctified because he is seen as having been scapegoated by that.
Okay, that's it. That's what I was having.
Right. And so this is, again, a point that Girard makes is that, because we've kind of internalized this Christian deconstruction of the scapegoat mechanism, we have, what Nietzsche would call a sort of bad conscience about the whole operation, right? So, but that doesn't mean that we don't do it, because there's a kind of easy way back into it, which is that you you can still engage in scapegoating by accusing others of scapegoating, right? And scapegoating them for scapegoating somebody, right?
Okay. That's why Derek Chauvin did not become the victim, hero, martyr, right? He was scapegoated, wasn't he?
I mean, I guess depending on how you view the case, which I don't necessarily want to get into. I mean, certainly, okay, yes, I would say yes, because to the extent that, there are different kinds of guilt, right? And I think it's important to see like legally defined guilt as different from the kind of guilt that pertains to the scapegoat, right? And we can see this in all kinds of Me Too stuff and all kinds of cancel culture stuff where like, it's completely separate from any kind of legal determination of guilt, right? There's just there's a different kind of guilt that is at work there, right?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
And so, right. So I would say Chauvin is scapegoated in the sense that he's made to represent the kind of ills of the society as a whole,
Yes.
right?
Right.
So in this way, he serves the function of the witch, as I described it,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Becomes the single figure on whom these kind of broader social crises can be blamed.
Yep.
And so to that extent, right, he is a scapegoat, which I don't think necessarily means he should or shouldn't have been convicted of what he was. I won't get into that argument now, but
yeah.
the point is that this is a different kind of guilt. Like it doesn't have to be legal guilt, although those two can kind of converge. But beyond that, right? So Floyd is transfigured because he is he can be seen as the pure victim of scapegoating, right?
Yep.
So this is both it's a kind of similar and quite different operation than the one I was describing, right? Because it involves a kind of coalescence around this figure who is seen, who is not exactly transfigured into a god, whose death is not seen as having been justified by his violations of taboos.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it's the opposite, right? It's seen as having been unjustified, right? And so so what I would argue is it sort of demonstrates that these patterns, right, where like a violent death can become this thing that the entire kind of social order like arrays itself around.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the way that and the logic by which that functions has been permanently sort of inverted by this kind of Christian perspective, whereby it's the victim whose perspective takes prevalence, right?
Right.
And so I think for Girard this was a double-edged sword, because he didn't see it as he sees again, like Nietzsche, I would argue in a more subtle way, he sees that this is a kind of essential intellectual and moral revolution, like as the central intellectual and moral revolution in the history of the human species, right? That the sort of, which for Nietzsche is the slave morality and rebellion. For Girard, it's, essentially the Gospels as this deconstruction of the entire basis of human culture and civilization, right? And so this is, but it doesn't solve our problems, right? Instead, and part of the problem with it is that it takes away, or it gradually erodes the stabilizing function of something like sacrifice, and makes it and forces societies to come up with other ways of resolving conflict. Some of these, he argues, and I would agree with him, are fundamentally good, right? And I would say that maybe this goes back to some of the questions about compacts, but like the rule of law is, whatever criticisms we might have of how it functions, is a fundamental good, and its emergence is enabled by the kind of hobbling of the scapegoat mechanism, right? That that you need other modes of conflict resolution once that one is no longer as viable. And it is in fact a more, humane and desirable one. Now that's, I think that opens up several cans of worms we don't need to get into. I think this also loops back to the whole point about economy, that, basically we can see from this perspective, like the market as a social and political mechanism that works to regulate conflict, right? And so it's not, its function is not like the function of the economy is not economic, right? It's actually fundamentally sort of social and political, right? And this is often made in sort of Marxist critiques as a highly negative sort of argument, but it can also from this perspective be seen as at least partially positive, because it does serve an essential function in regulating human conflict in the absence of essentially religion, right?
Well, okay, but I guess so. Nietzsche, I think, would see the summer of 22 and the making of George Floyd into an icon as simply the triumph of slave mentality,
right? Which
is not good to Nietzsche. This is kind of our problem, right? Is that we end up celebrating what is weak and poor and ineffective. And I'm with him on that. What would Girard say about what was accomplished in the summer of 2020?
I mean, what was accomplished my view, I read something on this, like my view is what was accomplished was Joe Biden was elected, like that was what was accomplished. Beyond that, what was accomplished, which, whatever, I don't really care. I didn't really care that much one way or the other, but, so what was accomplished was essentially galvanizing the broad kind of left liberal public around a renewed sense of the justice of their own positions, which then, motivated them to vote in great numbers in the fall. So, that's kind of my cynical read of it. Beyond that, kind of what was accomplished, I'd say, a larger part of kind of what came out of that year had to do with lockdowns and all of that. Beyond that, there were some kind of, attempts to reduce police funding.
From a Girardian perspective, because you've been saying that according to him, these sort of rituals, I guess, of creating victims and martyrs serves a salutary function for society. It reduces conflict, right? It gives us something to focus on and unify over.
That would be, the point of Christianity is that it makes that harder to achieve, right? And so I think, in fact, what you end up with is the opposite, right? That these things can be as destabilizing as they are stabilizing, right? And that's kind of why you need other social mechanisms to address conflict.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think much, I think as far as what was accomplished, what was accomplished was the expulsion of the great scapegoat Donald Trump from the social body.
There you go.
Which, who is kind of this. I wrote about this even before he was elected, and David Graeber did as well. That he kind of embodies this figure of the scapegoat king.
Sure. Yeah.
And this is particularly because he can be seen.
Right.
And here we can think about the interesting conflict between him trying to say the China virus, right, which is then sort of seen as an instigation to scapegoating of Asians and so on,
right, versus
the liberal version, which is essentially that it's the Trump virus, right? So he himself becomes responsible for the entire disaster of the virus and the response to it. And so, then I think there's kind of this fantasy that his sort of ritualized expulsion, not only from the presidency, but from all public platforms is going to heal the society. It doesn't actually really work.
Right.
I think, my own take on the politics today is we're kind of, there is a kind of restabilizing, which I don't think is necessarily very good, although it may have some good parts.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think basically we're in this restabilizing moment. So it worked to a certain extent, right? I think the expulsion, it didn't solve anything underlying, but the whole point of this kind of model is that it's cyclical anyway, right? It has to be, there have to be these kind of periodic purges.
Right. And it's psychological. It's
Yeah.
not material. Right.
Right.
Right. We have a psychological temporary unification. That's the result. That's the result of the purges and the victim and the scapegoating of the last few years, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to keep thinking about this guy, Girard, but thank you so much for this. And everyone, please go read Compact. And
please do.
And
subscribe.
And subscribe, most importantly. It's not expensive at all. And it's a wonderful, it is really a one-of-a-kind publication that I had been waiting for my whole life. Honestly, I'd been looking for a political magazine of that level of sophistication that also does engage with ideas across the spectrum that are often in conflict with each other. And it's a wonderful sort of example of intellectual pluralism at the very least. But I think there's also a deeper political project at work that we talked about earlier that I think is also really worthwhile and we've just never seen before. So and I'm so glad that you're the managing editor because I can't think of anybody better suited to that project of bringing people together and understanding very deeply all these very disparate political ideologies. So keep on doing what you're doing, sir, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the kind words. And please do check it out, subscribe, etc. if you have not, to all your listeners. And perhaps I hope we'll speak again, and perhaps there are future collaborations possible. So there are these things.
There are, and we will announce them soon. All right. Thank you, Jeff.
Excellent.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the unreported news analysis show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.